Picture this. You're standing in line at a coffee shop minding your own business when someone behind you starts talking loudly about how women don't belong in the military. They're going on and on about how real soldiers are tough men who've seen combat, not some pretty faces playing dress-up in uniforms. You turn around and see a young woman in civilian clothes quietly listening to every word. She looks ordinary, maybe even fragile to some. Her hair is neatly pulled back, her clothes are simple, and she's not saying a word. The loudmouthed guy keeps going, getting more offensive by the minute. But here's the thing about assumptions. They can make you look like a complete fool in seconds. What happened next in that coffee shop would become the talk of the entire military base for months. Because sometimes, the person you least expect to have power is actually the one who holds your entire future in their hands. Sometimes, the quiet woman you think you can intimidate has more authority than you could ever dream of having. This is the true story of what happens when disrespect meets reality, when arrogance crashes into respect, and when one revelation can change everything in the span of a heartbeat. Get ready for a story that will make you think twice about judging anyone by their appearance, because what you're about to read actually happened. And it's more shocking than you could ever imagine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's Coffee Corner, a small cafe that had become a popular spot for military personnel stationed at Fort Harrison. The establishment sat just outside the base gates, making it a convenient stop for soldiers grabbing their morning caffeine fix before reporting for duty. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison pulled his truck into a parking space, the engine ticking as it cooled down. At 28 years old, Jake carried himself with the confidence that came from 6 years of military service and 2 deployments overseas. His broad shoulders filled out his Army combat uniform perfectly, and his chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and badges that told the story of his service. The combat infantry badge gleamed prominently among them, something he wore with particular pride. Jake had earned his reputation as a tough, no-nonsense soldier who didn't hesitate to speak his mind. His fellow soldiers respected his combat experience, but some found his outspoken nature and traditional views about military roles somewhat outdated. Jake firmly believed that certain positions in the military should remain male-dominated, especially combat roles, and he wasn't shy about expressing these opinions. As he walked toward the coffee shop entrance, Jake's combat boots clicked against the pavement with military precision. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, and his military bearing was evident in every step. He had always taken pride in looking the part of a professional soldier, believing that appearance mattered in maintaining military standards. The bell above the door chimed as Jake entered the bustling cafe. The morning rush was in full swing, with a line of about 8 people stretching from the counter toward the back of the shop. Most were fellow service members, identifiable by their uniforms and military haircuts, mixed with a few local civilians who had discovered this particular coffee shop served some of the best brew in town. Jake took his place at the end of the line, checking his watch and calculating whether he'd have enough time to grab his usual large black coffee and still make it to the morning formation on time. The conversation around him was typical military chatter, discussions about weekend plans, complaints about upcoming training exercises, and the usual griping about military life that soldiers engaged in when they thought their superiors weren't listening. Directly in front of Jake stood a young woman who immediately caught his attention, though not for reasons she might have appreciated. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and a light jacket. She carried a small backpack and seemed to be absorbed in something on her phone. What struck Jake most was how out of place she seemed among the uniformed military personnel. She looked like a college student or maybe someone's girlfriend who had wandered into the wrong establishment. Her appearance was neat but unremarkable, and she possessed a quiet demeanor that made her blend into the background of the more boisterous military crowd. The line moved slowly, and Jake found himself growing impatient as he listened to the various conversations around him. A group of young privates near the front were discussing their upcoming field training exercise, complaining loudly about having to spend 3 weeks in the mud. Their conversation gradually shifted to more controversial topics as they began discussing the changing face of the military. "I'm telling you, man," said one of the privates, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. "This whole integration thing has gone too far. Pretty soon they'll be putting women in the infantry. And then what? We'll be babysitting instead of fighting. His companion nodded enthusiastically. No kidding. I heard they're already talking about lowering physical standards just so more women can pass the tests. That's not equality. That's dumbing down our military. Jake found himself nodding along with their conversation, though he wouldn't have been quite so crude in his phrasing. Still, he agreed with the sentiment. In his opinion, certain military roles required a level of physical capability and mental toughness that most women simply didn't possess. It wasn't about being sexist, he told himself. It was about maintaining the effectiveness of the fighting force. As the conversation continued, Jake noticed that the young woman in front of him had glanced back briefly, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem particularly bothered by what she was hearing, but then again, civilians often didn't understand the complexities of military life well enough to have strong opinions about such matters. The line moved forward another step, and Jake decided to join the conversation. His voice was confident and carried the authority of someone who had actually seen combat, unlike the young privates who were doing most of the talking. "You guys are absolutely right," Jake said, loud enough for several people around him to hear. "I've served 2 tours overseas, and I can tell you from experience that when bullets start flying, you want someone next to you who can carry their own weight and then some. Combat isn't a place for social experiments." The privates turned to look at Jake, immediately recognizing his rank and the combat badge on his uniform. Their expressions showed a mix of respect and validation. Here was someone with real experience backing up their opinions. "Exactly, Sergeant," one of them responded eagerly. "We're not trying to be mean about it, but there's a difference between what looks good on paper and what actually works in the field." Jake warmed to the topic, his voice growing more confident as he continued. "Don't get me wrong, women can serve their country in plenty of ways. Support roles, administrative positions, medical corps, there are lots of important jobs they can do. But when it comes to the tip of the spear, when lives are on the line, you need soldiers who can handle the physical and mental demands of real combat." The woman in front of him shifted slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of her profile. She was still focused on her phone, but something about her posture suggested she was listening to every word. Jake wondered if she was one of those liberal civilians who disapproved of traditional military thinking, but he didn't particularly care about her opinion. "I mean, let's be honest," Jake continued, emboldened by the agreement he was receiving from the other soldiers in line. "Most women can't even carry a fully loaded rucksack for 20 miles, let alone drag a wounded soldier to safety while under fire. It's not their fault, it's just biology. But pretending otherwise is dangerous for everyone involved." A few other soldiers in the cafe had started paying attention to the conversation, some nodding along while others looked uncomfortable with the direction the discussion was taking. The atmosphere in the small space had become charged with the tension that always arose when controversial topics were discussed in mixed company. The woman in front of Jake finally looked up from her phone and glanced around the coffee shop. Her eyes swept over the group of soldiers having the conversation, lingering for just a moment on Jake's face. Her expression remained neutral, giving no hint of what she might be thinking about what she was hearing. Jake interpreted her glance as curiosity rather than disapproval. After all, civilians were often fascinated by military discussions, even if they didn't fully understand the complexities involved. He decided to continue making his point, feeling confident in his position and his authority to speak on the subject. "The thing is," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the coffee shop, "military standards exist for a reason. They've been developed over decades of warfare and refined through experience. When politicians start changing those standards for political correctness instead of military effectiveness, people die." One of the privates nodded vigorously. "My drill sergeant used to say that the enemy doesn't care about your gender, they just want to kill you, so you better be prepared to kill them first." Jake smiled at that, remembering similar words from his own training days. Your drill sergeant was smart. In my experience, enemy fighters don't particularly care whether they're shooting at a male or female soldier, but they definitely take advantage of any weakness they can find. If you can't keep up physically or mentally, you're not just risking your own life, you're risking everyone else's too. The line had moved forward again, and they were now about 3 people away from the counter. Jake glanced at his watch and realized he was cutting it close on time. But the conversation had energized him. It felt good to speak with authority about something he truly understood, surrounded by fellow soldiers who respected his experience and opinions. The young woman was now second in line, close enough that Jake could see she was wearing small, simple earrings and a watch that looked military in style, though not necessarily issued gear. He still pegged her as a civilian, probably someone connected to the base in some way. Maybe a contractor, a family member, or a local college student who frequented the coffee shop because of its proximity to the military installation. As she stepped forward to place her order, Jake caught himself wondering what her story was. She seemed composed and alert in a way that suggested intelligence, but her quiet demeanor and civilian clothes marked her as clearly separate from the military world he inhabited. In his experience, civilian women often had strong opinions about military policies without really understanding the realities of military life. The conversation behind him had continued, with other soldiers joining in to share their own opinions about women in combat roles. The discussion had grown more animated, with voices rising slightly as people became more passionate about defending their positions. Jake found himself at the center of it all, his combat experience lending weight to his words and making him something of an unofficial spokesperson for the traditional military viewpoint. "Look," Jake said, addressing the group that had gathered around the conversation, "I'm not trying to be disrespectful to women. My own sister serves in the Air Force and she does a great job in her role. But she's in communications, not infantry. She knows her strengths and works within them. That's smart military thinking." The woman ahead of him was now placing her order, speaking quietly to the barista in a voice too low for Jake to make out her words. Something about her bearing struck him as familiar, though he couldn't place why. There was a certain precision to her movements, a way of standing that seemed almost military in nature, but her civilian clothes and apparent youth made that seem unlikely. Jake's attention was drawn back to the conversation as one of the younger soldiers made a particularly crude comment about women soldiers. While Jake agreed with the underlying sentiment, he felt compelled to moderate the discussion slightly. "Easy there, soldier," Jake said with a slight smile. "Let's keep it professional. The point isn't to disrespect anyone. It's about maintaining the effectiveness of our fighting forces. There's a difference between being realistic about physical capabilities and being disrespectful." The young soldier looked slightly chastened, but nodded his understanding. Jake felt satisfied that he had managed to maintain the authority of his position while keeping the conversation within appropriate bounds. Leadership, he reflected, was about knowing when to guide discussions rather than simply dominating them. The woman in front of him had finished ordering and stepped aside to wait for her drink. Jake moved forward to the counter, finally ready to place his own order and get on with his day. As he approached the barista, he was already reaching for his wallet, eager to complete his transaction and make it to formation on time. "Large black coffee," Jake said efficiently to the barista, a young man who looked like he might be a college student working part-time. "And make it quick. I need to be somewhere in 10 minutes. As Jake paid for his coffee, he noticed the woman who had been in front of him was still waiting for her order near the pickup counter. She was standing quietly, checking her phone again, but Jake got the impression she had been listening to the ongoing conversation that continued behind him in the line. The discussion about women in combat roles had evolved into a broader conversation about changing military policies, with several soldiers expressing their opinions about various reforms that had been implemented in recent years. Jake found himself occasionally contributing to the discussion even as he waited for his coffee, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who felt his opinions were well-informed and important. What Jake didn't notice as he waited for his order and continued to hold forth on military policy was the slight tightening around the young woman's eyes as she listened to the conversation. Her expression remained neutral, almost carefully composed, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was paying very close attention to every word being spoken. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge every assumption Jake had made about the quiet young woman in civilian clothes, and about the nature of authority itself. Jake's coffee arrived quickly, the familiar aroma of dark roast filling his nostrils as he lifted the cup to test the temperature. Perfect. Hot enough to wake him up properly, but not so hot that he'd burn his tongue trying to drink it quickly. He had developed a precise routine over his years of military service, and grabbing the right coffee at the right temperature was an important part of starting his day correctly. As he turned away from the counter, Jake noticed that several more soldiers had entered the coffee shop, creating a small crowd near the entrance. The morning rush was reaching its peak, and the combination of military personnel and civilians created an interesting cross-section of the local community. Jake recognized a few faces from his unit, including Corporal Martinez, a solid soldier who worked in the same company. "Martinez!" Jake called out, raising his coffee cup in greeting. "Didn't expect to see you here this morning." Corporal Martinez made his way through the crowd, grinning as he approached. "Hey, Sergeant Morrison. I heard there was some kind of interesting discussion going on over here. Something about military policy?" Jake chuckled, glancing back at the group of soldiers who were still engaged in animated conversation near the line. "Just educating some of the younger guys about the realities of military service. You know how it is. Sometimes experience needs to share wisdom with enthusiasm." The comment drew a laugh from Martinez, who had served under Jake's leadership during their last deployment. He respected Jake's combat experience and generally agreed with his straightforward approach to military matters, though he was sometimes more diplomatic in how he expressed his opinions. "What's the topic today?" Martinez asked, moving closer so he could hear better over the general noise of the coffee shop. "Women in combat roles," Jake replied, his voice carrying clearly. "Some of the privates were discussing the latest policy changes, and I was sharing some perspective from someone who's actually seen combat." Martinez nodded, knowingly. It was a topic that generated strong opinions throughout the military, and he knew that Jake had particularly firm views on the subject. While Martinez himself was somewhat more moderate in his position, he respected Jake's right to express his opinions, especially given his combat experience. The young woman who had been standing near the pickup counter had received her order, what appeared to be a simple coffee with cream, and was now moving toward the door. As she passed near Jake and Martinez, she slowed slightly, and Jake got the impression she was still listening to the ongoing conversation. "The problem," Jake continued, his voice rising slightly so that Martinez could hear him clearly, "is that policymakers who've never been in combat are making decisions that affect soldiers' lives. They're more concerned with political correctness than military effectiveness." Several other soldiers had gravitated toward the conversation, creating an informal gathering near the center of the coffee shop. The discussion had taken on the feel of an impromptu military briefing, with Jake naturally assuming the role of senior voice due to his rank and experience. "I mean, let's think about this logically," Jake said, addressing the growing group. "In my unit during my second deployment, we had several situations where soldiers had to carry wounded personnel for significant distances under enemy fire. The average weight of a fully equipped soldier is about 200 pounds, plus gear. Most women simply don't have the upper body strength to handle that kind of physical demand." One of the younger soldiers, a private first class named Johnson, whom Jake recognized from around the base, nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I was trying to explain to my girlfriend last week. She keeps talking about equality and fair treatment, but she doesn't understand that some things aren't about fairness. They're about capability." Jake pointed at Johnson approvingly. "Exactly right, Private. Military service isn't about giving everyone an equal opportunity to feel good about themselves. It's about creating the most effective fighting force possible to protect our country and complete our missions." The young woman near the door had stopped completely now, ostensibly checking something on her phone, but Jake noticed she was positioned where she could clearly hear the entire conversation. He wondered if she was one of those civilian activists who like to eavesdrop on military discussions so she could later criticize them online or in letters to the editor. "The thing that really bothers me," Jake continued, warming to his theme as he saw the engaged faces of his audience, "is when people who have never been in a life-or-death situation try to tell those of us who have what the military should look like. Combat isn't a social experiment. When someone's shooting at you, you don't care about diversity quotas. You care about whether the person next to you can fight effectively." Martinez, while generally agreeing with Jake's position, began to look slightly uncomfortable with the direction and volume of the conversation. He glanced around the coffee shop, noting that several civilians were now paying attention to the discussion, some with expressions that suggested they didn't appreciate what they were hearing. "Maybe we should keep it down a little, Sergeant," Martinez suggested quietly. "We're getting some looks from the locals." Jake followed Martinez's gaze around the coffee shop, taking in the mixed reactions from the civilian customers. Some appeared interested in the military perspective, while others looked distinctly uncomfortable or disapproving. The young woman near the door was still standing in the same position, though now she had lowered her phone and was openly listening to the conversation. "Let them look," Jake replied, though he did moderate his volume slightly. "This is America, and we're allowed to discuss military policy. Besides, maybe some of these civilians need to hear about the realities of military service. Too many people have opinions about the military without understanding what it actually involves. The comment seemed to energize the group of soldiers around Jake, several of whom began sharing their own experiences and opinions. The conversation expanded to include discussions about physical fitness standards, the challenges of integrating women into previously male-only units, and the political pressures that military leaders faced when implementing new policies. Private Johnson, encouraged by Jake's approval of his earlier comment, decided to share more of his thoughts. "My dad was in the Marines during Desert Storm, and he always told me that military effectiveness should never be compromised for social engineering. He said that when politicians start using the military to make social statements, soldiers die." "Your father sounds like a smart man," Jake responded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of wisdom that comes from actual military experience. The military isn't civilian society. It has different requirements and different standards because it has a different mission." The young woman near the door had now turned slightly, giving Jake a better view of her profile. There was something about her expression that struck him as odd. Not the curiosity or disapproval he might have expected from a civilian, but something more thoughtful and analytical. She seemed to be evaluating what she was hearing rather than simply reacting to it. Jake decided to address her directly, partly out of curiosity and partly because he felt confident in his position and wanted to engage with someone who might offer a different perspective. "Excuse me, miss," Jake called out, his tone friendly but confident. "I noticed you've been listening to our conversation. Do you have any thoughts on military policy? We're always interested in hearing different viewpoints." The woman looked directly at Jake for the first time, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze that was neither hostile nor particularly friendly. Up close, Jake could see that she appeared to be in her late 20s, with intelligent eyes and a composed demeanor that suggested she was used to being in situations where she needed to think carefully before speaking. "I find military discussions interesting," she replied in a calm, measured voice, "especially conversations about leadership and the factors that contribute to military effectiveness." Her response was diplomatic enough to be non-committal, but Jake detected something in her tone that suggested she had more definite opinions than she was expressing. He interpreted her reserved response as the typical caution of a civilian who wasn't sure how to engage with military personnel about sensitive topics. "Well, we appreciate civilian interest in military affairs," Jake said, his tone taking on a slightly patronizing quality. "It's important for citizens to understand what their military does, even if they haven't experienced it firsthand." Several of the soldiers around Jake chuckled at his comment, interpreting it as a gentle way of establishing the difference between military experience and civilian opinion. The implied message was clear. While civilian viewpoints were welcome, they carried less weight than the perspectives of people who had actually served. The young woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that Jake couldn't quite interpret. If he had been more observant, he might have recognized it as the look of someone who was carefully controlling their reaction to being underestimated. "Experience is certainly valuable," she agreed mildly. "Though I've found that different types of experience can offer different insights into complex issues." Jake nodded approvingly, pleased that she seemed to acknowledge the superiority of military experience while still maintaining her position in the conversation. He decided to continue engaging with her, partly because he enjoyed explaining military matters to civilians and partly because her composed manner intrigued him. "That's a fair point," Jake conceded. "But when it comes to combat effectiveness, there's really no substitute for having actually been there. I've served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I can tell you that the theories people discuss in classrooms or policy meetings don't always match up with reality in the field." The group of soldiers around Jake nodded their agreement, and several began sharing their own deployment experiences. The conversation took on the character of a teaching moment, with the military personnel sharing their expertise with an interested civilian audience. "For example," Jake continued, "people talk about physical fitness standards and whether they should be the same for men and women. But when you've actually had to carry a wounded soldier while wearing 60 pounds of gear and body armor, you understand why those standards exist. It's not about discrimination, it's about capability." The young woman listened attentively, asking occasional questions that demonstrated she was following the technical aspects of the discussion. Her questions were thoughtful and well-informed, suggesting she had more knowledge about military matters than Jake had initially assumed. "That's an interesting perspective on standards," she said after Jake had finished explaining the physical demands of combat operations. Do you think there are other factors besides raw physical strength that contribute to combat effectiveness? Leadership qualities, tactical thinking, decision-making under pressure? The question impressed Jake with its sophistication. Most civilians asked much more basic questions about military life, but this woman seemed to understand that combat effectiveness involved multiple variables. He began to revise his assessment of her, thinking she might be a college student studying military affairs, or perhaps someone with family connections to the military. Absolutely, Jake replied enthusiastically. Combat effectiveness is definitely multifaceted. Physical capability is just one component, though. It's a crucial one. Leadership, tactical thinking, courage under fire, all of those things matter enormously. The woman nodded thoughtfully. So you'd agree that someone could potentially compensate for physical limitations with superior performance in other areas? It was a clever question, and Jake recognized it as such. She was pushing back against his earlier arguments without being confrontational about it, using a Socratic method to explore the logical implications of his position. To some extent, yes, Jake admitted, appreciating the intellectual nature of the discussion. But there are certain physical requirements that simply can't be compensated for. If you can't carry your share of the load literally, it doesn't matter how smart you are tactically. The conversation had drawn the attention of most of the people in the coffee shop, with both military personnel and civilians listening to the exchange. Jake felt energized by the discussion and pleased with how he was representing the military perspective to a civilian audience. What Jake didn't realize was that he was about to learn something about assumptions, about the nature of authority, and about the danger of underestimating someone based on their appearance. The quiet woman in civilian clothes was about to teach him a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his military career. The intellectual sparring between Jake and the young woman had created an electric atmosphere in the coffee shop. Other conversations had gradually died down as more people tuned in to listen to their exchange. Jake found himself genuinely enjoying the discussion. It wasn't often that he encountered a civilian who could engage with military topics at this level of sophistication. You make valid points about physical requirements, the woman continued, her voice remaining calm and measured despite the growing attention. But I'm curious about your thoughts on leadership effectiveness. In your experience, what qualities make someone an effective military leader? Jake straightened slightly, recognizing that this was moving into territory where his expertise was particularly strong. Leadership had been a focus of his professional development throughout his career, and he had received positive evaluations for his ability to lead soldiers in both training and combat situations. Leadership in the military is about several key things, Jake began, settling into what felt like a teaching mode. First, you need credibility with your troops. They have to know you've been where they're going and that you understand the challenges they face. Second, you need to be able to make quick decisions under pressure, often with incomplete information. Third, you have to be physically and mentally tough enough to set the example for your soldiers. The woman nodded thoughtfully, and Jake noticed that several of the soldiers around him were also listening intently. Leadership was a topic that resonated with military personnel at all levels, and Jake's reputation as an effective combat leader gave weight to his words. Those are important qualities, she agreed. What about the ability to see the bigger picture? Strategic thinking, understanding how individual actions fit into larger objectives. It was another sophisticated question, and Jake found himself impressed despite his initial assumptions about her civilian status. She was clearly intelligent and well-informed about military matters, though he still assumed her knowledge came from academic study rather than practical experience. Strategic thinking is definitely important, especially as you move up in rank, Jake replied, but it has to be grounded in practical experience. You can't effectively lead soldiers if you don't understand what they're going through on a tactical level. The woman took a sip of her coffee, considering his response. Around them, the coffee shop had become unusually quiet, with most of the customers now openly listening to their conversation. Even the baristas had slowed their work to pay attention to the exchange. That's an interesting perspective on the relationship between tactical and strategic thinking, she said after a moment. Do you think it's possible for someone to be an effective leader without having exactly the same experiences as the people they're leading? The question struck Jake as slightly odd, though he couldn't immediately put his finger on why. There was something in the way she phrased it that suggested it might be more than just theoretical curiosity. It helps to have shared experiences, Jake replied carefully. When soldiers know their leader has been in similar situations, it builds trust and respect. They know you're not just talking theory. You understand the reality of what you're asking them to do. One of the younger soldiers who had been listening to the conversation decided to jump in with his own opinion. "That's why we respect Sergeant Morrison so much," Private Johnson said, gesturing toward Jake. "He's been there and done that. When he tells us something, we know it's coming from real experience." Jake felt a flush of pride at the comment, but he noticed that the young woman's expression had shifted slightly. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Not disapproval exactly, but perhaps a kind of analytical interest that made him feel like he was being evaluated. "Experience is valuable," she said, her tone still neutral. "But I wonder if there might be different types of relevant experience. Someone who hasn't been in combat might still have valuable leadership experience from other contexts." Jake sensed that she was pushing back against his position more directly now, though she was still doing it in a diplomatic way. He decided to be more explicit about his views, confident that his combat experience gave him the high ground in the discussion. "Look, I don't want to be disrespectful," Jake said, his tone becoming slightly more assertive, "but there's a big difference between theoretical leadership and leading people in life-or-death situations. Combat leadership requires a level of credibility that you can only get from having been there yourself." Several of the soldiers around Jake murmured their agreement, and he felt the support of his military audience. The young woman, however, didn't seem intimidated by the shift in his tone or the backing he was receiving from his fellow soldiers. "I appreciate your perspective," she replied calmly, "and I certainly wouldn't minimize the importance of combat experience for combat leaders. But I'm curious, do you think there might be situations where other types of experience could be equally valuable? Different contexts where different kinds of credibility might matter?" Her persistence in challenging his viewpoint was beginning to irritate Jake slightly. While he had initially enjoyed the intellectual nature of their discussion, he was starting to feel like she was questioning not just his opinions, but his authority to hold them. As a civilian, her theoretical knowledge was interesting but ultimately limited by her lack of practical military experience. "I think we might be talking past each other a bit," Jake said, his tone becoming more patronizing. "Military leadership is pretty specific in its requirements. It's not really comparable to civilian leadership contexts." The comment drew some chuckles from the soldiers around him, who interpreted it as a polite but firm way of establishing the boundaries between military expertise and civilian opinion. Jake felt he was being diplomatic while still making his point about the unique nature of military leadership. The young woman's expression remained calm, but Jake noticed that she straightened slightly, as if his comment had triggered some kind of internal decision. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, still measured and professional, but with an underlying firmness that hadn't been there before. "You're absolutely right that military leadership has specific requirements," she said, her eyes meeting Jake's directly, "which makes it interesting to hear different perspectives on what those requirements actually are." There was something in her tone that made Jake pause. It wasn't the response he had expected from a civilian who had just been gently told that her opinion carried less weight than military experience. Instead of backing down or becoming defensive, she seemed to be positioning herself for something. Corporal Martinez, who had been listening to the entire exchange, shifted uncomfortably beside Jake. Something about the woman's demeanor was setting off his instincts, though he couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering him. She carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her apparent civilian status. "Well," Jake continued, still confident in his position but sensing some subtle change in the dynamic, "I think most experienced military leaders would agree that combat credibility is essential for effectiveness in leadership roles." "Most experienced military leaders," the woman repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the phrase. "That's an interesting generalization. How do you think such leaders would respond to having their authority or credibility questioned by someone they assumed was less experienced?" The question caught Jake off guard. There was something pointed about it that made him feel like he had walked into a trap, though he couldn't see the mechanism. Around him, he noticed that some of the soldiers were looking at the woman with increased attention, as if they too were beginning to sense that something wasn't quite what it appeared. "I think," Jake replied carefully, that experienced leaders are confident enough in their positions to engage with different viewpoints, but they also understand the importance of respecting expertise and experience. It was a diplomatic answer, but even as he said it, Jake realized that it could be interpreted in multiple ways. The young woman smiled slightly, the first clear expression of emotion she had shown during their entire conversation. "That's a very professional attitude," she said, and Jake detected what might have been approval in her tone. It suggests the kind of leadership maturity that comes with experience. The way she said the word experience made Jake's stomach tighten slightly. There was something in her inflection that suggested she might have her own relevant experience to draw upon, though he still couldn't see how that was possible given her apparent civilian status. "Can I ask," the woman continued, "what you think would happen if someone in this conversation turned out to have more military experience than they initially appeared to have?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt the eyes of everyone in the coffee shop focused on him, waiting for his response. The casual nature of their discussion had suddenly taken on the feel of a test, and he wasn't sure he understood the parameters. "I suppose I'd want to know about their background," Jake answered slowly, his confidence beginning to waver for the first time since the conversation began. The young woman nodded, as if his response had confirmed something she had been wondering about. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of finality that suggested the theoretical portion of their discussion was about to end. "Background is important," she agreed, "and assumptions can be dangerous, especially when they prevent us from recognizing expertise when we encounter it." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The woman's words, her demeanor, the way she was positioning the conversation. Everything suddenly felt like it was building toward a revelation that he wasn't prepared for. Around him, he noticed that even the soldiers who had been supporting his position were now looking uncertain, as if they too were beginning to sense that they might have missed something important. The stage was set for a moment that would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about authority, experience, and the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. The quiet woman in civilian clothes was about to reveal something that would leave him paralyzed with shock and force him to reconsider everything he had said and believed about military leadership. In the silence that followed her last comment, Jake found himself holding his breath, somehow knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The tension in the coffee shop was palpable as everyone waited for the young woman's next words. Jake felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that something significant was about to happen but unable to see exactly what form it would take. The confident atmosphere he had created through his military expertise and combat experience seemed to be evaporating around him. The woman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a simple black wallet. The movement was casual, almost offhand, but something about it made every soldier in the room focus their attention on her hands. Jake watched with growing unease as she opened the wallet and removed what looked like a military identification card. "Since we've been discussing military experience and leadership," she said, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone, "I think it might be helpful if I introduced myself properly." She held up the ID card so that Jake could see it clearly. Even from several feet away, he could make out the distinctive format of a military identification card, but the details were too small to read at that distance. The woman noticed his squinting and stepped closer, extending the card so he could examine it properly. Jake took the ID card with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. As his eyes focused on the information printed on the card, he felt the world tilt around him. The name read Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and the photograph showed the same face that had been calmly engaging him in conversation for the past 20 minutes, Colonel. The word hit Jake like a physical blow. This quiet woman in civilian clothes whom he had been lecturing about military leadership and combat experience outranked him by several levels. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a senior officer with the authority to make decisions that could affect his entire career. Jake's hands shook as he read the additional information on the card. 22 years of service, multiple deployment ribbons, advanced military education credentials. Everything about the identification was authentic, and every detail told the story of a highly experienced and accomplished military officer. I don't understand," Jake stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're in civilian clothes. You didn't. How was I supposed to?" Colonel Mitchell's expression remained professional, but there was something in her eyes that might have been disappointment rather than anger. Around them, the other soldiers had fallen completely silent, many of them looking as shocked as Jake felt. Several had the deer-in-headlights expression of people who realized they had just witnessed a career-ending mistake. "You weren't supposed to know," Colonel Mitchell replied calmly, taking her ID card back from Jake's nerveless fingers. "That was rather the point. I was curious to see how military personnel would discuss leadership and military policy when they thought they were talking to a civilian." The implications of her statement crashed over Jake like a wave. Everything he had said, every opinion he had expressed, every assumption he had made, all of it had been heard and evaluated by a senior officer who had been conducting what amounted to an informal investigation of his character and professionalism. Private Johnson, who had been so enthusiastic in supporting Jake's opinions, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Corporal Martinez had gone completely pale and was staring at Colonel Mitchell with the expression of someone trying to calculate how badly this might affect his career prospects. "Ma'am," Jake began, his military training finally kicking in despite his shock, "I apologize if anything I said was inappropriate. I had no idea of your rank or position." Colonel Mitchell studied him for a moment before responding. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of her rank, but it wasn't harsh or punitive. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," she said, and Jake realized she had known his name and rank all along. "I'm not particularly concerned with what you said. I'm more interested in how you said it, and what your approach to this conversation reveals about your understanding of military professionalism and leadership." Jake felt his stomach drop even further. This wasn't just about having made inappropriate comments in front of a senior officer. This was about having his leadership philosophy and professional judgment evaluated and found wanting by someone whose opinion could make or break his career. "Your opinions about women in combat roles are your own," Colonel Mitchell continued, her tone remaining measured and professional. "Many soldiers share similar views, and there are legitimate discussions to be had about military policy and effectiveness. What concerns me is the way you express those opinions and the assumptions you made about who had the authority to participate in military discussions." The coffee shop had become so quiet that Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would unfold. "You assumed that because I appeared to be a civilian, my opinions were less valuable than yours," Colonel Mitchell observed. "You spoke to me in a patronizing manner and dismissed the possibility that I might have relevant experience. Most significantly, you used your military status to establish authority over what you perceived to be a civilian conversation." Each point she made felt like a nail in the coffin of Jake's military career. He had always prided himself on his professionalism and military bearing, but now he realized that his behavior had been evaluated by someone with vastly more experience and authority than he possessed. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell continued, "You allowed and encouraged a conversation that became increasingly inappropriate in a public setting. As a non-commissioned officer, you have a responsibility to maintain military standards even when you think you're off duty and among peers." Jake wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had been trying to share his knowledge and experience with younger soldiers, but he realized that any excuse would only make his situation worse. The truth was that he had been showing off, using his military status to demonstrate his authority and expertise to what he thought was an audience of subordinates and civilians. "Ma'am," Jake said quietly, "I take full responsibility for my conduct." "There's no excuse for my behavior or assumptions." Colonel Mitchell nodded approvingly at his response. "That's the first genuinely professional thing you've said since I started listening to this conversation, Staff Sergeant. It suggests that you're capable of the kind of self-reflection that effective leaders require." The comment offered a glimmer of hope, but Jake didn't dare assume that his acknowledgement of responsibility would be enough to mitigate the consequences of his actions. He had essentially conducted himself in an unprofessional manner in front of a colonel, and no amount of apologizing could change that fact. "I want you to think carefully about what happened here today," Colonel Mitchell said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a teaching moment rather than a punishment. "You made assumptions based on appearance. You used your military status to establish dominance in a conversation. You failed to maintain appropriate professional standards in a public setting. Most importantly, you demonstrated that your respect for military hierarchy depends on your ability to recognize rank and authority." Each point hit Jake with devastating accuracy. He realized that Colonel Mitchell was right about all of it. His behavior had revealed character flaws and professional blind spots that he hadn't even been aware he possessed. True military professionalism, Colonel Mitchell continued, means maintaining standards regardless of who's watching or listening. It means treating all people with respect, whether they're junior to you, senior to you, or civilians. It means understanding that your conduct reflects not just on you personally, but on the entire military institution. Around them, the other soldiers were absorbing the lesson as well. Many of them had participated in or supported the conversation that Colonel Mitchell was now critiquing, and they were realizing that their own conduct was also being evaluated. "I have a question for you, Staff Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Mitchell said, her tone becoming more pointed. "Based on this conversation, how do you think your soldiers would react if they discovered that someone they had been disrespecting or dismissing actually outranked them? What would that teach them about military values and professionalism?" The question forced Jake to confront the broader implications of his behavior. He wasn't just responsible for his own conduct. As an NCO, he was responsible for setting an example that would influence the behavior and attitudes of junior soldiers. His performance today had been a masterclass in how not to represent military values. It would teach them that military courtesy and respect are conditional, Jake admitted quietly, that they only need to maintain professional standards when they know they're being evaluated by superiors. "Exactly," Colonel Mitchell replied. "And that's a dangerous lesson for soldiers to learn. Military effectiveness depends on consistent professional behavior, not performance that varies based on who's present." Jake felt the full weight of his failure settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about having made a mistake. It was about having revealed fundamental flaws in his understanding of what it meant to be a military leader. Colonel Mitchell's impromptu lesson was showing him just how much he still had to learn about true professionalism. The revelation had transformed what Jake thought was a moment of sharing his expertise into a devastating evaluation of his character and judgment. The quiet woman in civilian clothes had turned out to be everything he claimed to respect about military leadership, while his own behavior had demonstrated everything that was wrong with his approach to authority and professionalism. The silence in Murphy's coffee corner stretched on, as the full impact of Colonel Mitchell's revelation settled over everyone present. Jake stood frozen, still processing the magnitude of his mistake while trying to calculate what this might mean for his military career. Around him, the other soldiers who had participated in or encouraged the conversation were equally stunned, their faces showing various degrees of shock, embarrassment, and fear. Colonel Mitchell seemed to be allowing the silence to continue deliberately, giving everyone time to fully absorb what had just happened. Her calm demeanor suggested that while this situation was serious, she wasn't necessarily planning to destroy careers over it. However, her position as a senior officer meant that whatever lessons she decided to impart would carry significant weight. "I want everyone here to understand something," Colonel Mitchell finally said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet coffee shop. "This wasn't an entrapment operation or some kind of formal investigation. I stopped in for coffee before a meeting on base, just like many of you probably do regularly." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "However, when I heard the conversation that was taking place, I saw an opportunity to observe how soldiers conduct themselves when they think they're among peers and away from formal military oversight." Jake felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. The fact that this hadn't been a planned investigation was somewhat reassuring, but it didn't change the reality of what had occurred or the potential consequences he might face. "What I observed," Colonel Mitchell continued, "was concerning on several levels, not just the content of some of the discussion, but the manner in which it was conducted and the assumptions that were made about appropriate behavior in a public setting." She gestured toward the civilian customers who were still present in the coffee shop, many of whom had been quietly listening to the entire exchange. "You were having a military policy discussion in front of civilians, using language and expressing opinions that reflect on the entire military institution. You allowed that discussion to become increasingly inappropriate, and you used your military status to establish authority over what you assumed was a civilian conversation." The point about civilian witnesses hit Jake particularly hard. He realized that his behavior hadn't just been unprofessional in front of a senior officer. It had also potentially damaged the reputation of the military in the eyes of the local community that surrounded the base. "However," Colonel Mitchell said, and Jake detected a slight softening in her tone, "I also observed something positive in the way Staff Sergeant Morrison acknowledged his mistakes when confronted with them. That suggests capacity for growth and learning, which are essential qualities for military leaders. The comment offered a glimmer of hope, but Jake didn't dare assume that it meant he was off the hook. Senior officers were skilled at delivering both praise and criticism in ways that served broader teaching purposes. I'm going to give everyone involved in this situation an opportunity to demonstrate that they've learned something from it, Colonel Mitchell announced. Staff Sergeant Morrison, I want you to think carefully about what happened here today and prepare a written reflection on military professionalism and leadership, focused particularly on the relationship between rank recognition and professional conduct. Jake nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. I'll have it completed within 24 hours. Take a week, Colonel Mitchell corrected. I want you to really think about this, not just write what you think I want to hear. Consider how your conduct today aligns with the military values you're supposed to represent, and what changes you need to make in your approach to leadership and professionalism. The extended timeline suggested that Colonel Mitchell was more interested in genuine learning than in quick punishment, which gave Jake some hope that this incident might become a growth opportunity rather than a career-ending mistake. As for the rest of you, Colonel Mitchell said, addressing the other soldiers who had been part of the conversation, I want you to consider what role you played in allowing this situation to develop. Military professionalism isn't just about individual conduct. It's about maintaining collective standards and holding each other accountable. Several of the younger soldiers looked relieved that they weren't being singled out for individual punishment, but Jake could see that they were also taking the lesson seriously. Colonel Mitchell's approach was teaching them about shared responsibility for maintaining military standards. Private Johnson, Colonel Mitchell said, addressing the young soldier who had been most vocal in supporting Jake's opinions, I want you to research and prepare a presentation on the history of women in military service, including combat roles. Focus on documented examples of effective female military leaders and the evolution of military policy regarding gender integration. Private Johnson's face went pale, but he managed to respond professionally. Yes, ma'am. What timeline would you like for the presentation? 2 weeks, Colonel Mitchell replied. And I want you to present it to your unit, including Staff Sergeant Morrison. This isn't punishment, it's education. Your comments today suggested that you have strong opinions about military policy without necessarily having complete information about the topics you were discussing. Jake realized that Colonel Mitchell was addressing not just the unprofessional behavior, but also the substance of the conversation.